Hello and welcome to Interpersonal Communication. My name is Professor Queen and I'll be your instructor throughout this course. Have you ever wondered why people act a certain way? Why do they do certain things? Why do they dress a certain way? Yeah, sometimes we're all amateur psychologists, and that is really what communication is all about, especially with interpersonal communication. How do you communicate with your friends? Or how do you communicate with your family? Is there a difference between the way you communicate with your coworkers and the way you communicate with your family? Why is that? All of this is what interpersonal communication is about. So before we start here in our beginning chapter, let's try to find a good definition of what interpersonal communication is and how is it distinctive from other types of communication.
To understand interpersonal communication, we must begin by understanding how it relates to two broader categories: communication in general and human communication. Scholars have attempted to arrive at a general definition of communication for decades, yet experts cannot agree on a single definition. In our class, we're going to stick with the textbook and say that interpersonal communication is a distinctive, transactional form of human communication involving mutual influence, usually for the purpose of managing relationships. Let's look at the first part of the definition: a distinctive transactional form of human communication. Well, what does distinctive mean? Really, distinctive means it's a certain type of communication that differs from other types of communication. For example, interpersonal communication is different from impersonal communication. Impersonal communication is a process that occurs when we treat others as objects or respond to their roles rather than who they are as a unique person. That sounds kind of odd that we treat others as objects, but there is a time and place that we do this. For example, if you're going to a grocery store and you walk up to a cashier and they ask you, "Well, how are you doing?" You say, "Great. How are you?" "Fine." Okay, that might be all the communication that's going on there, but you're treating each other as an object. You probably don't really care how they're doing, and they probably don't really care how you're doing, but we use these phrases in a cliche form. So impersonal is not rich between two people, but it's a way that we communicate. Then there's mass communication, a process that occurs when one person issues the same message to many people at once. The creator of the message is usually not physically present, and listeners have virtually no opportunity to respond immediately to the speaker. An example of this would be if you had to give a speech on the 50-yard line at the Super Bowl in front of 10 TV cameras that was being filmed at the same time, and you were speaking in front of the entire world. Okay? The audience doesn't necessarily have to be in that same room, and you're still communicating. If the audience isn't asking any questions, it could be your evening TV news. There's communication going on, but there's not a lot of response back and forth. Then there's public communication. This is a process that occurs when the speaker addresses an audience. There's may be an audience at a Kiwanis club or at a Rotary club, or you may even be speaking to a church or a graduation. There is an audience there in front of that speaker, as compared to mass communication where the audience is not necessarily in the same room. And we have small group communication. This is a process that occurs when a group of 3 to 15 people meet to interact with a common purpose and mutual influence on one another. Maybe you've worked in small groups before in other classes. When small groups get above 15, it's usually a little tougher to manage. So normally we like to keep these small groups between 3 and 15 people. Then the last one is intrapersonal communication. This is communication within yourself or thinking. This is you maybe worrying about an exam or thinking about a problem that you have in the family. Maybe even in your mind you're going over a dialogue that you think that you may have with one of your professors. Intrapersonal is just you and your thoughts. Small group, 3 to 15. Public communication, you're in the same room with the others. Mass communication, you do not have to be in the same room. And impersonal communication is where you treat others as simply as objects. And you may use cliche forms of communication. Now let's look at the communication model as it refers to interpersonal communication. First, on the left, you have the sender, or also known as the source. This is the originator of the thought or emotion who puts into a code, which could be words, could be nonverbal, that can be understood by the receiver. Then that person has to encode or translate these ideas, these feelings, and these thoughts into some type of code. Then the receiver has to decode the message to interpret the ideas, feelings, and thoughts that have been translated into this code. And there's different channels. These channels could be face-to-face, it could be a text, it could be an email, it could be a Skype. And within that we have noise, and the noise could be internal or external. If it's internal noise, it could be maybe your thoughts. Have you ever tried to listen to somebody and then your thoughts go elsewhere? Or it could be external. Maybe there's a baby crying in the background or construction work going on. And the receiver and the sender gives feedback to each other. If you're the sender and the receiver doesn't understand, maybe you can notice that by their nonverbal communication. Or maybe they'll tell you, could you explain that a little clearer? And all of this is surrounded by context. If you're a person talking to your friend and you talk to them at a ball game, you'll probably talk to that person differently if you're standing in front of a casket at a funeral. It's the context that matters.
We are only one click away from interpersonal communication. Most of us like to text or email or maybe send out blogs. All of this can be a good form of communication, but we have a certain term for that. We call that electronically mediated communication. It's also called EMC. This is the way we communicate via the internet. If you look at what we're doing now, we're taking a class online. About 50 years ago, this wasn't even a dream. I remember when I was in graduate school, I had to drive 50 and 60 miles in the evening to go to class. Now we can take it at home. You may be sitting on the couch, or you may even be in your car. But according to the EMC theory, we have to look at how can we make communication a little better. This leads us to another theory called the media richness theory. Let's take a look at that theory in a little more detail.
The media richness theory is a theory that identifies the richness of a communication medium based on the amount of feedback it allows, the number of cues receivers can interpret, the variety of language it allows, and the potential for emotional expression. If you look at this chart, the richer the medium is located at the top, and the leaner the medium is located at the bottom. So at the top of the chart is face-to-face. This is the richest type of communication. This is where we can look at the people in their eyes. We can tell by their body language if they agree with our message or are they getting aggravated. Then we can go down through the chart and you notice there's video conferencing. It's still close to the top. And a telephone, your cell phone, okay, we can hear the emotions in the voice, but it's not as rich as face-to-face. And we go all the way down to the bottom to unaddressed documents or a memo. This could even be a flyer that's been posted on a bulletin board. There's not a lot of opportunities for feedback, for us to carry on a rich conversation in between the two. We can try to figure out where this class fits on the scale. Obviously, the face-to-face, if we were in a classroom, this would be the very best type of medium. You could ask questions, and I could ask questions, and we could see each other eye to eye. We could have a neat conversation. If this was just a normal internet class where you just read a post and then reply, okay, that might be closer to the bottom. At least with this class, we're trying to do some video where you can see my eyes and you can hear my voice, and working in discussion boards where you get to talk to each other. It's not necessarily at the top, but hopefully it's closer than other online classes. Interpersonal communication connects us to others. There are some myths that are things that are not true about communication. As important as communication is connecting us to others, it is a myth that all interpersonal problems are communication problems. There's also the myth that more words will make things clearer. We know that's not true. Or meanings are in the words. No, meanings are in the people, not necessarily the words that they use. And information always equals communication. That's a myth as well, because a doctor can give you a lot of words about prescriptions, but if you don't understand what they mean, well, that information wasn't really communicated. But some things that are true about interpersonal communication is it's irreversible. Have you ever said something, and as soon as you said it, you wish you could take it back? You wish that you hadn't said that, but it was too late? Or what about interpersonal communication being complicated? Because interpersonal communication is complicated, it's a myth to assume that there are always simple solutions to every interpersonal communication problem. I bet you've had arguments with your spouse or with your parents at one time or the other. Just because you may be a good communicator and they may be a communicator doesn't mean that you totally understand each other. With interpersonal communication, we want you to be other-oriented, not always thinking about ourselves. Other-oriented communication and communicators are ethical. Ethics are the beliefs, values, and moral principles by which we determine what is right or what is wrong. We want to be honest, truthful, and trustworthy. Interpersonal communication is like breathing. It is a requirement for life, and like breathing, interpersonal communication is inescapable. Unless you live in isolation, you communicate interpersonally every day, listening to your roommate, talking to a teacher, texting a friend, and talking to your parents or your spouse in person or via Skype. All are examples of interpersonal communication. Whether on or offline, it is impossible not to communicate with others. Even before we were born, we respond to movement and sound, and we continue to communicate until we draw our last breath. Without interpersonal communication, a special form of human communication that occurs as we manage our relationships, people suffer and even die. Recluses, hermits, and people isolated in solitary confinement dream and even hallucinate about talking with others face to face, because communication is a way of life.